Let me welcome you to this pair of recordings and a video from the archives of the Fisher Center at Bard College. The composer of both works is a remarkable figure in Russian musical history, Sergey Taneyev. He was born in 1856 and died in 1916. Taneyev was born into a Russian family of noble origins, and his father, they were very highly educated and a very intellectual family. Even as a child, Taneyev's father was a real aficionado of Greek literature and classical texts. Taneyev was a fantastic pianist. He was the first student to ever win gold medals at the Conservatory in Moscow in both composition and piano performance. There are many reasons to remember Taneyev. Most music lovers will remember him through his friendship with the more famous Russian composer Tchaikovsky. He was also not only a pupil of Tchaikovsky's, but became his best musical friend. The reason Tchaikovsky respected Taneyev so much is because he was a consummate craftsman. And perhaps the other way people know about Taneyev is that he became a friend of the great Russian writer Leo Tolstoy, and Tolstoy's wife, Sofia, was infatuated with Taneyev. They had a close friendship. By all accounts, Tolstoy was somewhat jealous of Taneyev because of the admiration and affection that his wife had for the composer. Taneyev was nonetheless very attached to Tchaikovsky, although he shared many of Tchaikovsky's aesthetic or musical attitudes. He was politically probably, in our vocabulary, to the left of Tchaikovsky, which also explains his friendship with Leo Tolstoy, who was, for different reasons, a critic of the autocratic Russian system. Taneyev was a liberal figure, as some of the composers in the late 19th century were, and they lived in a Russia that was initially in the grip of a monarchical autocracy. So Nicholas I was famous for a tripart idea of what the state was for. And the state was about religious belief, orthodoxy. It was about autocracy, the exclusive power of the Tsar, and national solidarity, belief in the power and significance of Russia as a national entity. So these three pillars of Russian rule under Tsarist leadership or Tsarist rule were the sort of symbols of the Russian state. Taneyev was in a generation that didn't directly experience, but knew of the more liberal approach to the future of the monarchy by Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia, who liberated the serfs in his regime. He was assassinated, and his son, Alexander III, returned to a more autocratic rule, followed then by Nicholas II, the last of the Romanov Tsars, under whose leadership the Russian Revolution took place, spurred in part by the First World War, during which Taneyev himself died. Taneyev was on the liberal side of the Russian intelligentsia, not a conservative. And so this play and the setting of this play in the 1890s, when he finished the opera, was in fact a signal, a very carefully constructed signal showing a wish to return to the more liberal direction. Taneyev was also a major figure and teacher in Moscow. So Russian musical life can be viewed from the lens of two competing cities, St. Petersburg and Moscow. In St. Petersburg, the dominant figure was Rimsky-Korsakov, and the so-called nationalist school of the Mighty Five, which included Balakirev and Borodin and Cesar Q and Mussorgsky. And they believed in a very national art tied to a Russian sensibility, but very anti-Western. They were skeptical about the traditions of Western music making that go back to the classical era, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, and Brahms. And they were influenced much more by people like Liszt and Wagner, and the effort to create a distinctive Russian national voice. That was St. Petersburg. In Moscow, there was Tchaikovsky and Taneyev. Taneyev became the director of the conservatory in Moscow. He took over the teaching of composition, and he had many famous pupils, including Nikolai Metner and Sergey Rachmaninoff. The opera was, for Taneyev, his greatest achievement, and he worked a tremendously long time on it. Rimsky admired the opera, and for him, the opera showed that Taneyev was not a pedant, but an inspired composer who not only had melodic gifts and expressive gifts, but an unbelievable command of musical language, and could make an extended argument dramatically and beautifully, using both harmonic and thematic elaboration and counterpoint to make a great musical argument. The C minor symphony is an example of that. The Oresteia, which was Taneyev's major accomplishment, finally, through the intervention of Tchaikovsky and others, finally was produced in 1896, but it was a catastrophe. Taneyev was sort of finishing it toward the very end, and when it finally got to the stage, it was brutally cut, and it disappeared. It didn't have a success. It was revived in Russia in 1916, and then again after the revolution, but then disappeared again. But Rimsky thought it was a masterpiece. Stravinsky thought it was a masterpiece, and it had this sort of strange, legendary presence in history. So the great Russian operas that we all love, Eugene Onegin by Tchaikovsky, or Life in the Day of the Tsar by Glinka, these are either Russian mythological subjects or the Russian literary subjects, texts by Pushkin, or in the case of Rubinstein's The Demon, text by Lermontov, who is the other great poet of Pushkin's generation and writer of Pushkin's generation. So they're distinctly Russian, and we as audiences, from the very beginning, when Diaghilev, for example, brought Russian opera to Paris in the early part of the 20th century, it was exotic. The audiences in Paris expected a Russian stuff, Russian mythology, Russian costumes, folkloric imagery. And this opera was about a Greek subject. It was nothing Russian on its surface. It was a retelling, a political retelling, if you will, of a great Greek tragedy that had a pointed implication for the Russian audience for which it was written, but it was a hard sell. Why would a Russian composer write on a Greek subject? And it therefore didn't seem to be appropriate, marketable, if you will, to travel to Western Europe, or let's say to North America. This is both a Western subject, if you will, a classical subject, and a Russian subject, all combined into one opera. This is not a piece that requires any kind of apology. From the very first moments, you will find a gripping piece of music and drama, which has a magnificent ending and a startling first act, and it is both a personal drama of this terrifying family history, plus a political drama. The thematic material of the opera is very carefully structured and reused through the opera, so much so that Taneyev himself produced a concert overture, which sometimes appears in concert programs, which you won't hear on this recording, because we actually do the prologue to the opera that's for the staged version. But the themes that people may know from the concert overture obviously are taken from the opera. The opera is also very varied. So it's a three-act opera that parallels the three plays of Aeschylus. The story of Agamemnon's murder in the first act, the revenge of Orestes and Electra in the second act, and then the trial of Orestes and the reconciliation of the idea of violence through his exoneration and the dawn of a new era of human government, if you will. So each act has its own integrity, and it's in that sense like a trilogy, which the play is. So you have a trilogy in one opera. The story has to do with the revenge that Orestes takes on his mother for the death of his father. The predicament that Orestes is in is that he is sworn to revenge the death of his father, and in so doing, he has to kill his mother. And how do you balance those two obligations? And he balances them by the violence of killing his mother. The last part of the story is equally famous because it's the story of the transformation of human justice from violent revenge to deliberation by one's fellow human beings in the form of a jury. And Orestes seeks advice from the god Apollo, and he's told to stand trial, and the goddess of wisdom, Athena, casts the final vote, exonerating Orestes from having killed his mother. But this has to do with two competing sources of what we consider to be justice. One is our reason, our deliberation, our laws. And the other is the raw justice, which is represented by an older generation of divine figures called the Furies. So the Furies, in the last part of the Oresteia, argue that Orestes should be punished. So it's a cycle of violence. The father kills the daughter, the wife kills the father, the son kills the mother. And they argue for continuation of that. So then the son should be killed. But Athena and the jury, they intervene with the idea that the cycle of violence in human society has to come to an end, and that the idea of punishment and laws and the restraint of the desire for revenge through violence is a rite of passage from a society that's based on violence to a society that's based on the rule of law. The symphony is from approximately the same time in Taneyev's career. It was completed a couple of years after the opera. And it is, stands, in my view, together with the Pathétique of Tchaikovsky, or the Fifth and Fourth Symphonies, all of the symphonies of Tchaikovsky, as among the greatest Russian symphonies. In the Soviet era, after the Bolshevik Revolution, both the Oresteia and the Symphony in C, in fact, all of Taneyev's music, sank down because it was viewed to be, for its own reasons, too indebted to a Western European high art tradition. It was considered not as accessible, perhaps, as the revolution believed new music should be. It did not have a nationalist theme, which became important under Stalin. Now we're in a post-Cold War era in which all this has become irrelevant. And what we have in Sergey Taneyev is a great composer. And it extends not only to the opera and to the choral music, but to this symphony in particular. The symphony is in 4 movements and has a beautiful adagio, which is based on a thematic fragment from the first movement, and has a very funny scherzo, which some people think is a portrait of the composer. He had a sense of humor about himself, and a very dramatic, light, and also magnificent dramatic ending in the last movement. So it's in a standard 4-movement format. It's one of the great examples of the romantic symphony of the second half of the 19th century, and should take its place alongside the symphonies of Bruckner and Brahms. Please enjoy it. I thank you for listening, and I wish you all a safe and healthy journey through these difficult times.